Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Andy Croll, who is the CTO of CoverageBook, a conference organizer for Brighton Ruby, author, and speaker. Andy joins us from Brighton in the United Kingdom. Andy Croll, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
You dare say it. I think probably the most important thing is that code's read much more than it's written. So like the readability of it. And I don't just mean like beautifully coiffed perfect method names and all that stuff, which is great, or like comments or whatever your poison is. I mean like the weird stuff that you do should stay and look weird. That's my favorite programming hack for myself, is like, I'm going to make this bit look really awful. I'm going to leave like a horrible variable name in here, or I'm going to stick some junk at the top of a Rails view file, or any of that sort of stuff, as an aid memoir to either go, I didn't know how to solve this at the time, you shouldn't worry that you didn't know, future Andy. But yeah, that's kind of my personal go-to fix for myself.
Can you think of a recent weird example that you might have come across, that whether you'd written it or not, that you're like, oh, this is weird, but it's good that it's here in the way that it is?
Yeah, I mean, I've just taken on a couple of juniors at work. They sort of said, this partial, what's this bit at the top that looks like Ruby inside these funny little squiggles? And I was like, well, those are the variables that we depend on in this particular partial. And I wanted to show you where they came from. I wanted to show me where they came from originally. And like, we didn't quite know how to structure this partial. It's a bit unwieldy, but the unwieldiness is then front and center in the first 5 lines of the file. It's here's a weird setup object we use to define this thing that's sort of like in a halfway house between two different, the dreadful old state and the wonderful new state that we haven't yet imagined. So here's this halfway house where everything looks a bit ugly, but here's where that variable comes from.
Interesting. Is that more like a comment saying this is where this instance variable, or?
No, it's literally like I'm assigning a local variable inside the top of the template to make myself know that I didn't ever fully solve this in the past.
That's an interesting example there, because in the Rails space, there's tends to be kind of a push against that. You see that and you're like, why are you setting things that kind of like maybe too far down in the stack necessarily? But was that for things like for presentation layer specific things that you're trying to like, or it's just like, well, this actually gets called in lots of different places. We would have to define it in several controller actions, or?
Yeah, it's just like we didn't want to do the full rewrite of the stack of partials all the way down to here to get this to work the first time, or it was a bug fix that we had to ship quickly, and the next time someone's back in here, they should look to fix it. It's not, this is not an architectural style that I am proud of, but it's more a case of this is a thing that we should look at, and if you can work out when you're back in here how to get rid of that, that would be awesome. But it's just like, here's the weirdness, and put it front and center and keep it there.
Do you, don't want to get too far down in the Ruby on Rails rabbit holes there. Have you felt in your take on when to introduce using partials has changed very often? Or like, I feel like there was a period where we kind of maybe overused them a little bit because we were thinking that they would be reused a lot, and then they don't always end up being reused in different areas. So
yeah, I think, it's kind of a CoverageBook. We're now a view component shop. So we've taken GitHub's big view component project, and our front-end focused developer is a big advocate of that, and he built a gem called Lookbook that is sort of like the way that I think lots of view component-based architectures are sort of previewing their components and doing the development of those things. So we were relatively early to that, and that's mostly been a success. Like, working out how to use components is, it's a different strategy for every team, and it seems to be working mostly well for us. Whilst we have all these view components and stuff, but we still make use of partials, and we still make use of even the odd helper, gasp. So yeah, that's primarily how we're managing our the big mess that is Rails views. Easily gets out of hand. And, it gets out of hand when it's components because it's a lot, and it's the place where your customers end up touching your work. So invariably it expands in an almost unlimited way.
It's true. It's always like this thing with, we think about the MVC pattern and how we're using this stuff, and we have all the JavaScript. I've not personally taken a big deep dive into a lot of more modern JavaScript stuff. I've tended to just kind of stay away from some of that stuff. And then in my role in the company, that's just not where I end up spending very much time. But it ends up being, as you mentioned, like an area that has the most commonly interacted with directly with end users, but tends to be maybe the messiest parts of some of our projects in some ways. And maybe that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a sense where certainly that was my background is in front end. So like I came into Ruby via sort of the web standards thing in the sort of mid 2000s. So like I'm comfortable in the view, but I get the sense that lots of Ruby developers very much define themselves and try and leave the code at the controller level and not get involved in their views too much. Certainly, I think that's a fairly common, oh man, I don't want to deal with that. Like I definitely don't want to do any CSS. So yeah, that's where it feels. I don't know. It feels it's like almost the most organic bit in that it sort of grows in a way that's unpredictable, and there aren't necessarily good rules. And we're sort of developing patterns in it now. So you've got, the view component thing comes from React. Like it's trying to isolate those individual pieces, and in classic backend developer way, we'd like to test these properly, and we'd like to make sure that everything is defined. And there's a certain amount in which you have a little bit. HTML is great because it's so messy. It's sort of like you almost feel like you get your hands in it, and you get your hands all covered in p tags, and that's that's like a good messy thing to be involved with sometimes.
I always think back to that era, and I think in say the mid 2000s, why I felt like there was this interesting distinction was like between front end and back end developers on the project was that I'm like, the front end people can spend more time thinking about how this is going to work across different browsers. And then we got mobile devices that eventually popped up at some point. We're like, how many different things do we need to test in? So I think there was more like, we need people that can just spend more time, be really good at that, and just be like, and it's felt a little like chaos in some ways. I was like, it was hard for me to meet the front end developers that didn't grumble about projects and like, we still have to support this one version of IE for this client and what have you. Can't we just make them stop using that? I'm like, I wish we could, but they're, this is not the way the organization's set up to. They can't just install Firefox. But it was an interesting thing. Like I felt like, well, we can control the backend stuff. And like when I say the backend, like the model layer and the controllers, we get this all nice and well tested and just cross our fingers, everything on the front end is going to work well with the front end developers doing what they're good at. So it didn't make sense. I didn't believe that everybody can keep all of that knowledge in their head and be super great at it. The one developer idea there seemed like it was very far-fetched.
Yeah, and you get different elements of that, which is you get companies or organizations or teams where there's a very hard line and sort of not accept it. There's almost like a lack of acceptance on both sides that, the front end folks don't want to know anything about SQL, and the backend developers don't want to know anything about CSS, right? And that's like the most extreme versions. And that plays out in technology choices even. Like, that's why the Rails plus React stack is relatively common. It's not my personal taste in building apps, but like that kind of real hard boundary, almost to the point of like you can almost run them as two separate teams. I mean, that's absolutely no way I'd ever run a team, because I think the thing is, how it works is the product, but like you do see that relatively frequently. And that's, possibly because those things are, I remember from the web standards days, like it's a bit easier to support multiple browsers now, although, you've got much more variety in screen sizes. So, the complexity has moved in a different fashion, but like you're not having to write completely separate code to support, IE5 or whatever dreadful thing that made me cry when I was a much younger and better looking man. I think there's definitely like that hard boundary is definitely a thing.
It's true. I'm curious, just out of curiosity, what's your take on like the concept of a full stack developer?
I would sort of consider myself to be one because I came in from the front end, and now I've written hand rolled SQL that I'm proud of. That's
nice.
So I think it's about knowing where your own personal limits and interest are, And can you ship something useful to people based on your own skill set? Like, I don't think there isn't one definition for anyone. Like, there's various people who ship things with PHP scripts. They still FTP to a server somewhere, right? They don't do inverted commas proper development, but the things that they ship are very useful. Like a flat, static HTML site can be a useful product to people. Like a PDF can be a useful product to people. So yeah, I don't think of it in terms of how many individual skills you have listed on your CV. It's more like how useful can you make your skill set to the rest of the world.
I'm curious about, as you're in your role, does your team talk about things like technical debt often?
Do we talk about anything else? It's so easy to get 3 weeks away from something you wrote and hate what you did, or like be, oh man, I wish we'd done that better, or we did not foresee how customers were going to use this and therefore bend our assumptions. Yeah, so we're constantly working out ways that we can improve our understanding and then putting that into code. Like understanding how customers are actually using the thing that we built, restating our assumptions based on more knowledge. So yeah, I think we don't tend to talk about it in terms of like we have a bunch of technical debt. We tend to talk about it in it would be nice if this thing worked in a different way, or this wasn't JSON, or if this was a join model, if this wasn't a join model, or if we stored this somewhere else, or if all of these things were a subclass of something else, or these things all kind of behave the same, so maybe they should all have a similar interface. Like it's very organic, and we have quite a small team, so those are fun discussions as much as they are the work.
When those types of things pop up where you're maybe questioning, now that you're reacting to actually to how people are really using it, or your tech, because basically most of what we're shipping when we're writing software is like we have some assumptions or some ideas or hypothesis about this is going to work with like X. It ends up being used like a Y or some flavor of X. You're like, well, all right, maybe now that we're seeing this play out, we could probably rethink some of this stuff. Do you document those things in any way? Do you have like some formal-ish? You mentioned that kind of like an organic conversations that might pop up. What sort of way do you keep on that so that the team feels like those may be addressed or they might get prioritized? Or is it just when it's enough of a pain point, then you deal with it at that point?
I think those discussions, they sit in the air, and that's fine until we're ready to work on them. Because, if you write down something that's, I've just got this idea of how this might work, and, it's a conversation over lunch, or when you're trying to solve another problem and like the conversation gets sidetracked by the thing that everyone's really annoyed about, or you've been PagerDuty'd twice this week for this thing, but we want to finish the other feature first. So I think it's fine for them to sit in the air, and we only really document them when we're about to work on them, because like trying to like list those things, we've got areas where it would be nice if we could refactor this area of the code so that it doesn't do this thing that is bad for us. We very much have a policy or sort of a headline in our team of which is like making life better for ourselves as well as for customers. So like if I'm getting paged every night after I finished work because the scikit queues are filling up, or user experience has gone wrong because the US are online and I'm in the UK, like those things don't have to last very long before, as a small team, we're able to go, okay, let's spend some time on this. Like, how would we do this better? Where's the real problem? Is it a quick fix, or is it oh man, we've got to rewrite this thing and migrate a bunch of data?
Is your organization one that kind of was founded with a technical, someone in the leadership team having some software experience, or?
It sort of was and it wasn't. So the product CoverageBook came out of an agency, a PR agency in the UK, and Gary, who's the founder of CoverageBook, wanted to get into product. He was sort of done with agency, PR, SEO agency work. So he hired someone locally to help sort of run a mini startup thing inside the agency business, and the owners of the agency were willing to fund that. And they built a CRM, because every agency's first software product is a CRM for their industry. And there was one thing in it that, they tried to sell the CRM and it was going all right, and they found themselves sort of doing more enterprisey sales, but that was not what they wanted to do as an organization. They wanted to be self-serve. They wanted to, sell software to lots of different smaller companies for like $100 a month, like have this traditional SaaS business. And one thing when they were doing the demos that people leant forward for was this CoverageBook idea, which is a thing that all PR agencies, which is like proof of work, effectively. It's like, we got you this coverage in the New York Times. It's, we think that was a target for us. Its notoriety, your product sales then changed because of it. It's that. So, but it was the menial task that is done by the interns in the agency and takes forever. Like you can consider it like cutting out the column in the newspaper where your product got a mention, but it's like the digital version of that.
Right. That makes sense. So sometimes I talk with developers where they don't feel like they're able to keep up with the product side of the business. That's like dreaming up all this stuff. And they're like, well, I'm just in React. We're fixing bugs, doing things. And like the wish list of things, it's not really our decision when we get to work with, unless we sneak it in somehow, like we put that into a sprint or however the team's organizing their workload. And based on how you were talking about it, it seemed like your team might have a little bit more there might be more understanding about the developers need to make their lives better, and that's a good thing. And the team has trust by the other areas of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, we're only a team of 13, so like the development team's about half of that. And the whole make life better thing has always been a thing. It was a thing in the agency before, and so the idea that the people in the agency would be beasted to like work harder to earn more money is not necessarily. We aim to be profitable, but the whole ethos of the business is to make it sustainable, to the point where we're separate from the agency now, but the agency themselves have gone off to become a B Corp and be interested in sustainability, and we plant trees with some of our revenue and like all those good things. Like it's a responsibly run company, both in terms of like its wider impact as well as how we treat each other and how Gary and I plan the work that we all do.
Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode of Maintainable. While you've been listening, has anyone crossed your mind who might be looking for help with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon, the producer of Maintainable podcast, would love to meet them. In fact, we've got a pretty sweet referral bonus program set up. If you send someone our way and they sign up for Planet Argon services, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And your reward? We'll send you $1,000 just for connecting us to the right person. Sounds like a win-win for everyone. Head on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more info. That's planetargon.com/referrals. All right, let's get back to this week's episode.
What are some technical hurdles that you've encountered or needed to jump over while working on legacy code bases?
We did a massive rewrite, which you're not meant to do. So we did a massive rewrite over the last couple of years. It probably started initially like sort of 4 years ago. So you said were there technical people involved at the start? And yes, they brought in some technical expertise, but much more in a prototypey way, like very good at like setting up and running prototype exercises for 10 weeks, 12 weeks. What do we have at the end of it? That kind of like sprinty kind of work. What happened then over time was, with a relatively inexperienced team, obviously getting more experience, they built a product that became almost impossible to move. Like it had the main interface for customers was one massive page that did everything, broadly speaking. And so it became incredibly difficult to both change the UI of that thing, but also like change the technical underpinnings of it. And so we sort of set out to just separate it all out as much as possible, but like without becoming sort of a microservices massive estate, because again, small team, that's always been the aim, is to keep it relatively small and sort of have a high impact for those people who are in the business. So yeah, like primarily our product has a sort of user interface for creating these reports. And then there's a whole data collection piece. And we found that to be a really nice, like hard boundary where there's not there's not a vast API between those two things. And one Rails app can go off and do all this data collection and see APIs and take screenshots and work things out and store metrics over time and all this sort of stuff, and then just pass all of that information back. And then it can be treated by the sort of the customer-facing report building app, almost like a third-party service. And so that was the first thing we did, was we built this thing that we call the Vault, where all of these URL, and it has no customer identifying data in it even. It's just like we give it a URL and then it goes and does a bunch of stuff and then tells the main app about it. So like that was our first thing, was like cleave this giant app in two, because what was happening was the customer app, the data collection was blocking things that the customer needed to do. So the customer would be doing things and they would be using the interface and it would all slow down to molasses because they'd put 1,000 URLs in and it wasn't built to scale that level. So it became sort of a victim of its own success from a technological perspective.
Having a system that's doing a bunch of that gathering and not necessarily hitting the same database or at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We actually just inherited a project recently that's also for an agency that they built their own thing where they've got like a data hub system. So they call it a hub, and then we got like the client portal that they take care of. And like, yeah, we needed to separate that out because it was just the customer thing would be a little bit more brittle at times in the UX, and we didn't want to like ever have that potentially somehow break the data collection stuff that it needs to be doing all the time. So you talk about that, and like there's two pieces of your system there, but being careful not to like all of a sudden just turn that into like, how do you keep breaking it down to like now you've got 20 microservices doing all those things? Yeah.
So it still needs to be understandable to a relatively small number of individual human brains. So like 2 feels reasonable. And I think it's really dependent, I guess maybe we're doing what those Rails and React folks are doing with their front ends and their back ends. To a certain extent, our data collection Vault thing is the back end that powers, the sort of the user interfacey bit. Even though that user interfacey bit is like a fully fledged Rails app that, you could imagine us buying that collection service from somebody else. But we think that's where some of our secret sauce is. So
nice. I want to pivot the conversation for a bit. One of the topics I was really keen to speak with you is first Ruby friend.
Yes. So
for those listening, and not everybody all of our listeners are in the Ruby or Ruby on Rails communities, but could you provide a little bit of, provide our audience with a proper introduction to it?
So I went to RailsConf in Portland in May last year, and as at all these big conferences, like any big programming conferences, typically they'll ask the big audience in one of the keynote sessions, like, how many people is this their first XConf? And arguably a third of people put their hands up. And I was like, wow, there really are still, even though, Ruby on Rails isn't the new hotness anymore, there are still a bunch of people put their hands up as new to that conference. Obviously there are people who just like have never got to one and are now there. But there was enough faces that looked younger than mine that I presumed they were relatively new to to our community. And I thought, well, what's the thing that we should do to support them? And like a lot of boot camps still teach Ruby because it's a good teaching language. And, Rails lets you get productive quickly, like all of these good things that still appeal to me now. And I thought, well, one of the things that the Ruby community is known for is its friendliness. And so I was like, well, how can I weaponize that? And so I decided to launch using a static website and a spreadsheet and in ConvertKit mailing software, a global mentorship program where I basically hit friends of friends of friends up on Twitter and said, would you like to be a mentor for 6 sessions over a 6-month period for like half an hour for someone who's new to Ruby and new to our community? And the sort of response has been really terrific, to the point where it's, once a month I sort of half dread the spreadsheet fun of like matching people up geographically and by language and all of those things. But like people have got jobs through it. All the feedback I get is mostly like, it's been really great. My mentor's really friendly. It's really helped me. They pointed to me at these resources. Like it's been a really positive thing. And I'm just sort of through the first 6 months or so of it. I sort of launched it in July, I think, last year. It was the first pilot group through there. And so it's about 400 matches so far. And I get like 40 or 50 new applicants every month. And I'm just sort of trying to work out how to make that bigger without obliterating one of my weekends every month with the matching process. And I deliberately didn't know what it was going to be, so I didn't build anything to manage it other than a spreadsheet. And now that spreadsheet is creaking at the seams, so I might have to Rails new my way out.
But I think it's great to for people listening to just remind ourselves that it's okay to learn to walk before we start like assuming that the things are going to take off. You never know how that's going to play out, and so being able to like manually do that stuff, and I think that's pretty awesome. Have you thought about scaling it without more software and just have other people help with the? Do you feel like that's your secret sauce, is you being such a good matchmaker?
I don't think I'm a good matchmaker. I feel like I could, a couple of scripts would probably do it to like work out what time zone people are in based on where they said they were. That would help me rather than me opening Google Maps and finding out where obscure American cities are. It's like, that's in Ohio, cool. To try and match people up so that, the main thing about the mentorship thing is like, it's not intended to be in person. Although if I can put people in the same city, I will. But it's more about like, is it going to be convenient for people? Like it's not a huge time commitment, but it's substantial, and like it should be easy for the mentors to help. Like, so I try and encourage the mentees to come prepared and be flexible and all of those good things. So like, I just think it's a good thing. And like, I'm not sure another programming community would do it. I don't know, maybe they would. It certainly could scale if the volunteers are there. Like that's the major blocker is finding volunteers, although I've got more mentors than I have mentees. But that's only because I can go and find some boot camps, and hopefully the plan is everyone who gets mentored then goes on to become a mentor. Because I think people who are 6 months, a year, 2 years out of a boot camp have so much more applicable advice to someone who's just about to leave than say I do with nearly 15 years of Rails experience, right? Like how much do I know about getting a junior job? Very little, other than on the hiring side. So
yeah, that's true. That's one of the things that we think about in our organization. And when we're bringing in, we bring interns almost every quarter, and then we often find that the best people to spend a lot of time with them are our other junior developers.
Yeah, the people just in front, right?
And yeah, they're it's like they can see themselves like in a year from then. It's like, but it also helps reinforce that the juniors have learned way more than they thought, give themselves credit for, and they can start to see like their own transformation. And then it's not that it stops there. Then we've got people who will get paired up with people across the team and stuff like that. But seeing that happen, like I'm also curious, is there a certain point when they don't no longer need a mentor themselves? Like I say that as someone that filled out the form last night, so I put myself on it. So I'm going to be part of your next weekend matchmaking experience, but maybe Robby needs a mentor from time to time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like everyone needs someone to work out their shit with, right? Like whether it's, personal therapy or, work therapy. So yeah, like I don't think that need ever goes away. I think possibly the thing that I do is I do encourage people to, certainly the mentors, to not feel obligated that this is their person to look after forever. Like this isn't a parenting relationship. This is something you can do for 6 months and go, I hope that was helpful. I don't have the time right now. Or, I've enjoyed this, or I haven't enjoyed this. Like some people are mentoring for the first time, and they should feel able to put that relationship down or let it get really loose. And that's fine. Email me if you have a specific problem, or you're having a crisis at your current job, or whatever that is. But like, there's no pressure to continue that mentoring relationship. Because, it's like, I try and be this way in my personal life as well. It's like, sometimes it's okay that friendships end. And that's a really weird thing to say, but I'm 43 years old. I am in touch with some of my school friends, but not all of them. And there are people who, when you have kids, like you get really close with, say, your group of friends who have kids at the same time, or people you meet at a play group or something, and then you drift away because you're in different parts of the city, and that's okay. It's the same with work relationships as well. Like, when you leave a job, you might stay in touch with one or two people, right? Like you don't have to maintain every relationship forever, which is why Facebook got so difficult.
It's an interesting thing. It's as someone that's hired a lot of people over the years, I sometimes wish people kept more in touch with me as they've gone on in their career. I'm like, do they remember me? Was I important to them? Do they give a shit about me? Was I just someone that gave them a paycheck? I don't know. I go through a lot of different like emotional roller coasters over the years of navigating this. And, occasionally I'll reach out and try to connect with people. Actually, just coincidentally, like yesterday, like a former employee from a couple of years ago asked if I could meet up for drinks in a couple of weeks. And I was like, awesome. That's great. So if you're listening, I'm just putting it out there, and you work for me or work for someone else, say hi to people. And anyone, just say hi to someone today that you haven't talked to, you do think about. And maybe one of the questions I want to ask you was, given that you're kind of leading the charge a bit with this project, first Ruby friend again for people, who has been one of the most important mentors in your life?
I should probably call them and say hi, actually. Like there's a VP engineering, so I was at a company called House Trip. There's a guy called Paul who came in, and I think he was sold a job, and then the company basically disintegrated around him. I think he was sold this sort of growth VP, bring on and, bring up these seniors and make them great team leads and potential VPs of engineering. And literally the company 4 weeks after he joined they couldn't raise money and they went through a round of layoffs. And so like the team he thought he was joining suddenly halved in size, if not even more than halved in size. And so I think his job changed dramatically from what he was expecting. And I just learned a lot about, in some ways, I think there was a couple of us who sort of, the structure was very flat. There was, it was only like 10 or 15 engineers, mostly senior by that point. And he was sort of in charge of engineering. And I think there was a couple of us who sort of got close with him on a consigliere basis, where like we were not his official number twos, and we weren't managing anyone, but there were people who he lent on for what's going on with X, or how does this feel in the team? Like, what's your read of everything? And I just learned a lot about managing small teams and strong personalities from watching him do it. And yeah, I think he put a lot of trust in me. I was relatively new to the organization as well when all this happened. I'd only been in like 3 or 4 months when this happened as well. So like the organization had changed around me as well. But I feel like he trusted in both my technical diagnosis of various problems and also like my people radar. So I learned a lot from him. And I learned a lot from like my current Gary, the founder of CoverageBook. Like I learned a lot from him. Like we've got very different skills and slightly different temperaments. And often we play the roles of he's the one who wants to build a new feature and I'm the guy who says no, with a smile on my face. But like we have the same goal in mind, and we talk honestly with each other. And I think there's a mentorship to peer relationships as well, I think, which is a nice and valuable thing.
It definitely can be. One of the other things I want to talk about with community building was, I'm curious how long you've been involved with Brighton Ruby.
So I moved back to the UK in 2013 with a heavily pregnant wife. I didn't know anyone who worked in Ruby or Rails in the UK, and I was surfing the end of a startup that I started in Singapore. So I sort of landed back in the UK, didn't know anyone, thought I should go to a conference because I'll meet people there and find work. And there wasn't one at the time. And so I thought, well, I'd run a conference in Singapore. So I was like, well, I could start one. And so that was both a good and terrible idea with 18-month-old twins by the time it rolled around. So yeah, I started it as a way to meet people in the community for myself, purely selfishly almost. Also I wanted an event that I didn't have to travel to and an event that was to my taste as well. So like, the best way to do that, of course, is to do it yourself, he said, stupidly. And now I'm up to, this will be the 10th year, if not the 10th event. So I'm just trying to fix on a date for the summer. But yeah, I'm trying to encourage more smaller conferences everywhere. So even in the last couple of days, I've heard of a couple of ones where people have heard me say this sort of thing and have gone, yeah, do you know what? I could do that. It's not that. If that idiot can do it, then I can do it.
It's interesting. I'm assuming that's like an in-person thing as well now. It has been probably. Did you have to shift anything around during the pandemic or?
Yes, there was. I suddenly noticed ticket sales were slowing in sort of like February 2020, and I was like, oh, this is weird. And so I emailed the chap who runs the ticketing software, Tito Paul, who's done events before, and that's how he ended up doing ticketing business. And I was like, are you seeing this? And he's like, we are seeing this everywhere. My ticketing business is terrified. Yeah, I went online that year. And it was good. We did some fun stuff with it, but like I didn't run it the following year when it would have had to have been online as well. Like I'm not a massive, I'm a primate who likes to see other primates in the flesh. Like, so that's what I'm there for. That's why I run it, is to get people together. Because I think there is a special kind of something in the air when you get lots of people who understand what you do and put them in a room together. I think that's incredibly valuable, even for the most introverted among us. I think it's a good scene to be a part of. So I'm happy it's brought it back last year in person, and it'll be again in person this year.
We'll be back with our interview with Andy in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers on social media, maybe dropping a link to this episode in your team's Slack channel, or write a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, is there someone in the industry that you think I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to that interview with Andy Croll. Is there a kind of a best practice that you find that permeates through our community that you kind of disagree with?
I would have used to have said lots and lots of end-to-end tests, like the sort of the whole Cucumber era, the idea that tests could be written by non-technical people in this sort of mystical, magical world. I find that, and some people, like I've got good friends who have apps where that is still a thing and they really value them, and like I don't disagree with their experience, but for me it's never been something that has helped really ship less bugs. Like absolutely, like smoke tests around, get those tests running for the most important parts of our application, like make sure your checkout works, make sure your primary functions work, perhaps get some like screenshot based testing for like visual elements that you might break accidentally in other parts of the app. But most of the tests that we do are to stop us breaking stuff we don't realize. In my experience in the last five years, and even then you don't stop bugs going to production. So like having really, really slow tests that spin up browsers and exercise every single route through an application, that never has worked for me. In fact, some of the best things we've ever done is like we deleted an entire Cucumber-based test suite and replaced it with a couple of smoke tests, and like the coverage only dropped like 5 or 10%. Because you exercise quite a lot with your first end-to-end test.
That resonates with me. And I'm sure there's a number of companies out there that are using Cucumber and have people in, I'm air quoting, the business side of things writing
the given when then tests.
Yeah, and they're writing these things, and like that's how they communicate as an organization with each other. I can appreciate the desire to get to that, but in my world, in my reality, most of those projects, that's never been the case at the company. Most of my clients, they've never gotten to that point. They have people that are like, I don't know, we need to get this stuff shipped. And then the developers make their best guess about how to do that. And then it evolves and stuff from there. And when you get automated tests at all, sometimes that's actually a nice thing, but that doesn't even always happen. It's an interesting challenge we have in the community. But yeah, thanks for at least answering that question, something I've been thinking about asking people. So you're one of my first guinea pigs. Are there data metrics that you find valuable to track with your team to kind of like in terms of like the software delivery cycle?
We don't actually, we're a very small team, so like that doesn't super help me. I think probably in a bigger team where I was a bit less in touch with the day-to-day work of people who worked in the product team, then maybe it would be better, maybe more useful. Like, I've done things like Code Climate have sort of like a delivery product, I can't remember what it's called, where you sort of measures like the frequency of PRs and how long they're open and what the time to review is and how long before they're merged. And those things just tell you what you already know, in my experience. Like you're just like, I already thought that person wasn't quite where they think they are themselves or where their teammates need them to be. So I think I get naturally antsy if I don't ship production most days, which is most days. So it's like, that's, I really feel like that's my metric that I sort of care about. It's like, is stuff getting merged? Is it really bad because I've blocked production deploying for 3 days with my consistent bugs in the checkout, right? Like I'm still shipping code and able to block staging and production from going out with my own ineptitude. So like, that's my main, have we shipped production? Yeah, that's the question we get asked every morning by the automated robot in our chat room, which is like, what do we need to QA to get production out today? And that's our one thing that we really care about.
When thinking about data metrics of different teams, I've heard a lot of people kind of, well, we don't really have any specific metrics that we're tracking. And we have other companies, other people I talk to, they rely on that because it's so important for the reporting back to, I think, justifying why they have jobs. I don't know. It's just like it's just like an interesting thing, or that the team is improving something. There's some trending in a positive way because, and some people need the data to help support that. Otherwise, it becomes a subjective thing. Well, like, how does the team generally feel about the state of their delivery process, and where should we be making changes, or what do we hope to gain when we add another person? How do we know if we're being overworked or we can't keep up? Is that just because we feel like that's the case? And it's interesting trying to be analytical about this stuff when there tends to be a lot of subjective.
Yeah, I think you end up, again, like it's the same as that, like I talked about, you end up finding numbers that support the thing that you feel. And we have we've got application monitoring, and we've got code coverage, and like those things are useful, but not as soon as you measure something, like you can game it. So like I'm trying to have metrics there that I can go, this thing I'm feeling is I feel like we're not shipping as much as we used to. I'll go and look at how many PRs we've merged. Like I can do that work because those things are always running, but I'm not using those to do the management of the human beings who make the software. And like at the end of the day, like you can deliver loads and loads of software, but if it's not actually useful to the people who are using it, then it doesn't matter how fast you're doing it.
That's true.
That's the most important thing is like the software ends up, either making money or making change in the world. Whether you've got to be building the right things first, and that's very difficult to measure with numbers.
Indeed. So a couple of quick last questions, and one of the, for our listeners, let's just imagine there's a developer out there that's on a team and they feel like they've voiced some concerns about technical debt, or there's some things that are not making their lives better, and like they've heard from their peers or whatever. Not right now. We'll come back to that later and address that. Maybe they feel like they've heard that a few too many times. Do you have any advice on what sort of action they could take today on how to potentially remedy that?
Other than sort of glib and flippant things, not really. I mean, I think that's the intractableness of human beings making things, right? I don't think there is a simple answer. Like if your organization cannot support a healthy work environment, then you have problems. In the same way, and I think the only solution really is to gain enough power to change that environment or to leave that environment. And I don't think those are things that you can do with specifically wicked bits of Ruby code. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not, you can't look outside, you can find allies, it's all what, you might derisively call, politics or office politics. Like, but politics is just a measure of soft power or hard power. So it's like trying to establish where those no's or those laters are coming from and what's the driver for those things. I think you have to like do horrible things that outside consultants might do, like power maps. And, it doesn't have to be that formal, but like, why is my boss saying I can't do technical debt, even though he knows or she knows that we need to do it? And then you have to look above and find some context, and you have to look above and find some context. And like, what's the business doing? Is the business losing money? Like, what's going on here? And why are they behaving like that? And only with that sort of wider understanding can you even start to make a difference in that organization.
Do you think there is an onus on, when you have conversations with your own teammates, how do you help them understand that, or at least gain that perspective outside of saying like, you're just going to need to figure out how to like navigate that over time. But like, there's always this illusion that the grass is greener somewhere else and that company won't have any of these problems. They'll just probably have a whole different set of problems, right? And so,
everyone's got their own organizational scar tissue, right? I mean, we've had that. Like, I think for us, it's about the organization has to actually care. And I don't think you can fix that without power or understanding it. And so in our organization, we're really open about the finances of the business and how many new users we're getting. And like, because it's a small team, we can do that. But I think there are ways that bigger companies can do that. I think if you have a reasonable justification for the way that you're behaving that isn't entirely fear-based, then I think that goes a long way organizationally. Like, I think a lot of decisions are made from fear and then justified. I think as human beings, we're very fear-driven beings. So I think if you can take that fear and go, okay, right, I'm just behaving this way because I'm scared that this is going to break, or someone's going to think I'm not working, or any of these things. And you see even big organizations operating out of fear. So I think if you can operate out of a place without fear, I think that really helps, because then this is a guess. Of course, everything's a guess. Like, we don't know how the world works. It's way too complex for us to understand. But we think this feature is going to move user numbers this way, and that's why we're doing this. And if we don't ship a feature, then we're going to lose customers to our competitors, or just because they won't use it. Like, you have to have a justification that isn't just like, I'm scared, I want to be seen to be doing something.
Right. That's good. That can give people and myself some things to kind of reflect on a little bit. One of my favorite things about having these chats with people is that I'm often talking with different organizations, in a sales capacity for my team. And, they're coming with, we need X. But I'm like, let's talk about your problems a little bit more, like I can kind of get a little bit more context about like what's going on over,
Tell me about your childhood.
yeah, exactly. Like who hurt you at the company or what do you think is hurting you as a company? And it's usually not the most obvious thing that you think it might be. Tends to be. There's usually a lot more things at play or people that may no longer be there but left some damage along the way.
Yes, absolutely. That happens so much. Like for the longest time, we didn't have stand-ups every morning. And like, it's because they got out of hand and were used as a tool of coercion for the noisier members of the team. So like people got allergic to them and then someone new joined and said, oh, why don't we have stand-ups? That seems like a good thing to do for a inverted commas agile team. And I was like, you're completely right. And we should definitely do that. But we're going to keep an eye on this particular ritual. It's about making your rituals work for you.
That's another good point to think about. Is just because something might not have worked in the past doesn't mean it won't work in the future. And that's been a thing that I've needed to learn to accept over the years. Like there's these ebb and flows of like when we start using things, and don't keep doing the same thing just because you've always done it. Be willing to like get rid of some process, and people can see that as like a breath of fresh air for a while until someone recommends it. I've also needed to learn to be like, not immediately respond when someone proposes an idea like that. Like, why don't we do stand-ups? Be like, well, we used to, and then we didn't. Like, they don't need to know the whole history of why it worked and didn't work. Like, let's give that a go, and not treat it as like, someone else on the team that's no longer here for the last 2 years suggested we stop doing it.
And they were right at the time. It felt right at the time.
Don't do new things. So is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers most often?
Non-software. I mean, there's two. So in the last year, I started tracking my reading a bit more. And so one book I really loved last year was a thing called The Overstory. I can't remember the name of the author. It's sort of an ecological story over time. And it was both mortifying and strangely comforting at the same time. And it was a wonderful, it's just a wonderful novel. And the other thing I recommend is finding the media that makes you happy. And it's, people might call it a guilty pleasure, but it's just a pleasure. So I like the Lee Child, Jack Reacher books because they know exactly what they are. And I think they're almost parodic in their sort of, it's like the Littlest Hobo, if the Littlest Hobo was like 6'4" and built like a bodybuilder and was, hitting people with his strong forearms and getting the girl and all that sort of like they're cliche in the best way and very well written. So I love those as an escape hatch when I've been reading too much sort of like self-help or business books.
Yeah. You mentioned in The Overstory. I read that probably about a year and a half ago. I love that book. It was just I'm trying to remember the name of the author. I think it's Richard Powers.
Yes, Richard Powers. Yes, it's delightful and awful.
Yeah, and it was one of the things that another made me think for where I happen to be, where I live in Oregon, which is in the Pacific Northwest. The timber industry is like historically a big thing here, and so it's one of the reasons I moved here was because I'm like, I'm going to go save trees. So there's a lot of different reasons that that book resonated in a lot of interesting, weird ways. But I love that book, so it was a good recommendation there for people.
So it's a double recommendation, folks.
Yeah. Yes. So where can listeners go to learn more about you and follow your thoughts and ruminations about software development?
I'm sort of old school. I have a website which has got my name on it. So andycroll.com is probably the best place to go. I have a newsletter that I send out ideally fortnightly, but realistically slightly less than that, which has got like Ruby tips in it. And like if anything sort of special happens on top of that, it ends up in the little header on top of the useful writing, hopefully the useful little Ruby problem. But yeah, First Ruby Friend is please sign up to that if you're in the Ruby community and want to help. And it's really not that hard, and you can just be friendly to people, and that goes a long way. That's
wonderful. Yeah, I'll include links to that in the show notes for everybody. And it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Andy. Thank you so much for talking shop.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Pleasure to meet you.